Hello and welcome to hopefully whether a delightful morning or afternoon or evening, wherever you are at listening. This is David Frank, and I'm here with TJ Espinoza, my co-host on New Kinship, and we have with us our friend and guest today, Shela Chan. Welcome, Sheila.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
So happy to have you.
So did we just meet this past year? No, we met before. I met you at two Revoices ago, and we got a exchange, and you were sharing about some of your PhD work, and I was like, this gal is fascinating. I love the things that she's studying about and researching. And then we got to connect again at this past Revoice a little bit more, and super glad to have you with us today.
Yeah, well, I mean, I love what you guys are doing. So I think we actually connected. So it was the Columbus Revoice, and I had just watched your guys' breakout session. So you guys were working on kinship, community, spiritual friendship, and I was just blown away. And I loved that TJ was bringing in all the sociological data, and I thought how brilliant to have all these folks who are interested in social sciences come into the conversation in the Revoice context.
Yeah, that was actually, Sheila and I connected this past Revoice more seriously. And I was so thankful to finally meet someone who is also engaging with the social science work, which is very relevant. And when we talk about like sexuality and faith and community and kinship, but not, I would say the side B community is not currently that well equipped. A lot of people have theological understanding and backgrounds, but less of the social scientific, and even less of those who can connect theology and social science, which is a pretty rare, it's a rare person who can do both. So I was so happy to meet Sheila, who's actually engaging in that project, especially from the theology side, which we'll talk about more in a bit.
Yeah.
But yeah, Sheila, let's first just begin. Can you tell us a bit about yourself, like where you're from, who your community is, kind of your recent history or your long ago history? Like just, what tell us more about you. We'd love to hear more.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a Pacific Northwest girl. I grew up in Western Washington and went to the University of Washington for my undergrad degree, which is actually when I became a Christian in my junior year. So it was very much in the narrative of common evangelical narratives. I came to Christ in my junior year. It was during a time of this existential crisis. And I think really interesting. I think even as I look back and I was thinking about this interview and I'm looking at, okay, so I think I came out in regards to the queer aspect of my life, the first year of undergrad. And so that was freshman year and not before long, right? 2 years after I realized that. So I think this kind of clues us into kind of part of the spiritual vitality of the narrative that I want to bring, that as it comes to, I think, queer liberation, which without diving too deeply into it too quickly, I think common narratives are, especially I think from our secular perspective, will commonly have this thing of at least kids who maybe grew up in the 90s or the early 2000s, that there was still so much of this. There was the Trevor Project, and folks were saying that there was so much angst growing up as a queer kid that you couldn't really express yourself in whether the public school system or whatnot. And then you get to this narrative part, you're in college and you're exploring your sexuality or whatever. And so that's kind of the common trope or narrative, right? And so for me, it was really interesting because I think so with the queer aspect of my life is not a choice, and really having, I think, it having been repressed up until college and realizing I even, had this part of me that I thought I was kind of going along with that narrative. Oh, well, here's a time in which I can find liberation of this aspect of myself. And, I could explore friendship in these communities and then build all of this. And yet it was actually not satisfying enough, right? And so hence, cue Jesus. And this is not to, make any kind of qualitative assessment, I guess, on the queer community or anything, but even getting to do that and making queer friends and all of this communal aspect, it wasn't satisfying. And so what ended up happening was junior year had this existential thing, had to do with some family stuff. And I was on this massive worldview search, this massive existential search for meaning. And I remember exploring things such as I ordered these books on Schopenhauer, or there was this other book, I think it was an intersection of Nietzsche and Buddhism. And all of this was the summer of 2010. And so this part of me, I do think, was a little bit providential. So I had gotten to this book on the sociological study of monolithic religions. And it's very much a secular perspective in what you're kind of talking about, how there's, this pluralism, and then there's kind of a movement towards monotheism. And of course, it's such a complex conversation. All that to say that somehow led me eventually to C.S. Lewis and then to Tim Keller. And then that September, I was invited to New York by my cousin, who's very much a devout Christian. He was going to Redeemer Presbyterian Church. And I attended Tim Keller's service. He was preaching on 1 Peter 2, 9 through 12. And that's the passage, if you recall, about being called into his marvelous light and being part of his God's sacred treasured possession. You're the royal priesthood, and you're to glorify God. And I'm really telling you, this was a transformative time for me. And that also paired with, this was a 1 week kind of duration of this kind of a switcheroo. And I remember, so this was a very experiential part, which looking at things through an epistemology of something that's a lot more concrete and lived experience, I think really does show its efficacy in terms of how we assess our reality, right? So I love that this piece was there. And I remember that I was still, even though I was researching all these world religions, and world religion, that's heavy baggage on that word, so I might use different terminology for that. But all that to say, I actually was still kind of skeptical with regards to Christianity, even though I have this really lovely, well-meaning family member who was like, hey, come over here and check things out, and just showing me a lot of love. And I remember at that moment, I was still really I had this rebellious bone in me, and, knowing the queer aspect of my life, how is this going to sync up, or will it even sync at all? Or would I be able to accept stepping into, I think, a space with folks with beliefs and presuppositions that might be wildly against what even my identity, or I don't know if I would consider my identity, but an aspect of me, right? And so, this was 2010, which was during Obama, and already kind of in the political airwaves, DOMA was being discussed, and it was very public, these conversations. It was getting sexuality and gender, they were really kicking up, and so definitely on the forefront of my mind. And so the experiential part, I remember one night sitting at my cousin's apartment, and he just came up to me and asked me basically, hey, I want to pray for you. Will you let me pray for you? And it was just such a generous offer, right, from all perspectives. And somehow I still remember how reluctant I was, and kind of this indignant, oh, well, fine, I guess I'll let you pray for me. And I kid you not, the moment he started, I just started weeping. It was waterfall tears. And I really don't think it was just being moved by a showing of care from another human being. That, looking back in retrospect, it was a very special moment, and kind of, I don't know whether it was an encounter with Holy Spirit, or, somehow just really experiencing, I think, Jesus for the first time. And the next thing I know, I'm back in Seattle after that trip. And I'm looking for a church, and I'm looking to get baptized. And January 2011, I was baptized, and the rest is kind of history. Yeah, started doing mission work in 2018. I was with an organization called the World Race. Their parent organization is Adventures in Missions. And it was a mission trip in which it was about a squad of 30 people, and you traveled to, the slogan is 11 in 11, so 11 countries in 11 months. And we ended up doing, I think, for our particular route, 15 countries. And it was a really interesting, informative experience of totally being called out of the ordinary, and then just being able to witness the diverse expressions of Christianity around the world, and really being humbled. So, missional rhetoric, speaking of nuances and complexity, we can get into that, right? And I think that the thing I took out of it was that there was this beautiful witness of, I think, of what God's doing around the world. I think insofar as what it was as an experiment, maybe a social experiment in Christian community, I think in an ideal way, it was really incredible. So that you have 20 and 30-year-olds and you're from different backgrounds. We had a lot of Americans, but we also had an Australian and a New Zealander, and all coming together, essentially living together in various kind of formations of smaller groups throughout this 11-month duration. And you're really doing life in a very intimate, communal way. And what I would have to say is something like that, two things for me. I think first showed me that the ideal, something of like a Bonhoeffer style of life together, Christian community, is something that we should strive towards. And I think something that you guys probably really resonate with in terms of vibes as well.
Yeah.
And I also think there's a realism that we have to take, because I think there was a kind of life that was beautiful, that was achieved, I think, when we were all out in the world and we were in contexts that were unfamiliar and that weren't kind of entrenched in our daily lives, and maybe also entrenched in the various forces and the political systems and all the internalized social currents and forces that I really do think really reassert their weight, especially once people kind of return back to their usual life and whatnot. And so I mentioned that in particular because I think it is one of the trajectories in which, as we move into maybe some of the more academic aspects of the conversation later, it really ties into it. We're talking about the ecclesial belonging of queer people. You're really having to weigh all these factors, and right, you can't just, oh, well, here's this community that I want to build. And it's really, you're getting into the nitty gritty basically, right? And so after that, anyway, I did about a year of mission work in Lebanon, entire Lebanon, and mainly actually taught music. So I was a music missionary, if you will. Came back and got my Master of Divinity at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. And then midway, there was kind of this bringing together of what I was experiencing as a queer person and also my own spiritual faith journey. So it was 2022 American Academy of Religion, which is a conference that basically is the guild for religion scholars and theology scholars and whatnot. So I show up to this conference. I'm really interested in attending this intersection of queerness and faith talk, basically, right? And I just remember that morning, feeling fairly neutral going into this conference. And at that time, I was in this discernment phase, basically, of having been steered towards academia at the advice of a few professors or whatnot. I felt like I had this piece figured out, and I was also really wondering exactly how this tied into my story and how this tied into the need of the world of what I would be working on. And the one of the things that's ironic is I didn't want to be pigeonholed into the one topic that I thought I would probably be pigeonholed into, which was maybe queer liberation and justice or something. Well, I'll tell you what happened. Paper presider person kind of overseeing the session told us at the beginning of the presentations, hey, can we take a moment of silence? And I'm scratching my head, figuring out what was going on. Pulled open my phone, got my news app out, and basically there was a shooting in Colorado Springs at an LGBTQ club. And we were going to take a moment of silence because this thing that happened about an hour's drive away. And here we are sitting here at AAR and talking about queer justice. And it really hit home in that moment that this research, as cliche as something like this might sound, really actually had to do with lives. And that as much as I think sometimes in the academic pursuit, we as human beings can make it be about something else, in that moment, it became really clear to me in kind of an existential way in my own story that, oh, this actually really will matter. And at that moment, I thought the pigeonhole concern kind of went away. And so all that to say, that steered me into the direction of academia. And then so the second half of my MDiv, I started pursuing basically doctoral studies, and I applied to a number of programs, had a few different options, and I decided to go with Fordham University theology department, theological and social ethics, because they really do have one of the most, I think, invested programs on the questions of sexuality and gender, and just deep appreciation for the tradition as well, but in, a very robust kind of a critical engagement kind of way. And so that kind of leaves the story to the current moment where I'm at right now. Second year in my program.
Thank you so much. Can I ask, you said you were teaching music. What are the musical instruments that you play?
Yeah, so I'm actually a drummer by trade. So I went to public school, and so I started percussion in the fifth grade, and then kind of played it through high school. And it came back when I was on the world race. And I kind of love this part of the story also. I found this random Egyptian hand drum called the tabla, or the doumbeke, if I'm pronouncing that right at all. I picked it up for 21 USD at a Jordan market, and I took it with me for the rest of the trip, and I became our worship drummer for the rest of the time. Post school, I guess that came back, and I was invited to go back to Lebanon, which is one of the countries that we were in on the world race. There was a Southern Californian music teacher who actually moved there and started this ministry and said, hey, look, we would love to have another music instructor. We would love to have a percussion instructor. And so I was very grateful for the opportunity to do it. And that led me to spend a year in Tyre.
Super cool. And I think it's really fascinating, having that global multicultural experience, and then thinking about the different ways that you are being extracted from your cultures, finding community, finding belonging in that community, as a kind of parallel to also the connections between like different Christian subcultures and queer cultures, and the different ways that we're finding belonging, and what are the unspoken kind of postures, cultures, beliefs that, aren't always at the forefront of our attention, but deeply impact the people's felt experiences and how we actually embed our lives as Christians in all these different cultural contexts. So I'm just, grateful for you to kind of bring those things to light.
Sheila, I'm curious though, from this time of 2011 when you're baptized to the time that you started seminary, and in your seminary times, where was the queer aspect of you being kind of placed in your life? Was it kind of a marginal part of your life? Were you putting it aside? Like, how are you engaging this part of your life during this time of, I think, a lot of growth as a disciple from probably 2011 to 2018?
Yeah, I actually love that question, because I think, first of all, it brings out the importance of, I think, the way that conversations, especially in faith circles, the way that, well, really, I mean, largely politically, the way that sexuality is framed as such a center object, a center thing of attention. There's, I think, a lot of undercurrents underneath that as to why that became the case, right? And so I think for me, during those years from 2011 to my missional time, I did really, I think, just focus on my spirituality, and I maybe did have my queerness on the back burner. I'm the type of person that I think I like to do things all in, and I had this question posed to me by various scholars, predominantly maybe in more of the progressive side of things, and when I explained to them, well, I started off my faith journey in a Reformed Calvinist context, right, under Tim Keller's kind of direction or vibe or whatnot. Right, very much conservative. And see, I think the interesting thing with Keller is he had a queer brother. And so he actually, I think, out of various evangelical voices, was probably a lot more nuanced and complex on this topic. And so it's interesting because there's also, right, controversies with him and later on with, I think, with Princeton Theological. And there was a talk, he was, or an award and all of that. And he didn't get to, I think, all of that. Anyway, all that to say, 2011 to 2018, queerness on the back burner. Even though I accepted that I would have to wrestle with how sexuality played into my faith, especially with the context of it being, I don't love the terminology of affirming or non-affirming, but very much on the side of traditional marriage ethic. And I think I wanted to kind of suss out for myself how authentic the spirituality, I think in terms of the kind of the reform of Christianity I was signing on to, I wanted to explore for myself the validity of it. And there was that leap of stepping into it. So there was a faith aspect to it, but it was also just continuing to explore it and living it out. And I'd have to say one of the things with sexuality is it's something that it doesn't go away. And needless to say, you know, I don't think it's always in an unhealthy repression kind of way, but sooner or later, you will deal with it, right? Or you will feel the necessity to address it. And so first part of it kind of on the back burner, but I think after mainly, I think my world race journey, and then even maybe after Lebanon, I soon started to realize the thing that really caused me to engage with it in a more robust way. So I did say how I appreciated the communities, the missional communities that I was in because of this striving after kind of a life together model. And yet there is a part of it that is slightly, I think maybe slightly disillusioned. I mentioned previously how social oppressive structures reassert themselves, especially as everyone kind of goes back to their ordinary life. I think I saw those undercurrents. It became clear to me that we have to take more of a critical realist approach to how churches deal with sexuality, even if you're kind of putting forth this, we accept people as they are, and we also disciple people, right? That's a common line, right? And you do have to ask, there might be a few leadership figures that are invested in the question, but if your broader congregation or the church at large is still operating under severely underdeveloped theologies of sexuality and gender, they don't know the history, or they're not well versed in theology. And this is not kind of a denigration of maybe like not having an opportunity to have time to research on these issues. But it really matters because when you're still holding on to theology that might lend itself to something like reparative therapy, or which is, by the way, making a comeback in some circles, which is really concerning. When you still kind of have really just unthoughtful, uncritical, or unnuanced approaches to sexuality, it's going to have negative internalizing effects on queer people in your community. And so no matter how much, even if well-meaning Christians are operating on, we're trying our best to, you know, by the grace of God, build community, there are still kind of these little micro, I don't know if I would say aggressions, but kind of like these maybe hierarchies that are inbuilt. And so whether that is purely on the level of sexuality, or whether it's also racially intertwined, and there's also, right, gender. If you're in evangelical Christianity, you're still very much in a very patriarchal environment. And, right, of course, that's a different story. But when you have all these different things coming together, I think as a woman and a queer person and person of color, not just person of color, but also Chinese American, especially with the political tensions, the geopolitical tensions, I think I really felt the short end of the stick of some of those really like kind of hidden dynamics, the undercurrents that people don't really talk about or try to shy away from, but I think inevitably kind of damage or poison the well, if you will. And that really caused me to think about my sexuality and start thinking of the liberative elements.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you for naming that. I was just talking to a gay friend who his move to side A was just because he couldn't find thriving in side B churches. And it might be the kind of general side B of just conservative, like they're not explicit, there's nothing explicitly hateful,
Right.
coming from the pulpit, but there's not a culture of that promotes flourishing and meaningful belonging, and it just, yeah, he's just like, I can't. And then he went and visited affirming churches, and he's just like, people seem to be able to, there's something different here, even though he's now found their theology to be pretty flimsy and people aren't really interested in the ethical questions he's interested in. Anyways, just the point that there really is more work to be done in our communities than just getting a pastor aligned.
I just want to add something to this, though. I know this fellow again, who David Frank is mentioning a bit, and I think he shifted to side A in the past 10 years. Like, it wasn't last year, but also it's not only that there wasn't a good word to say to queer people, side B people, about how to live a life, but also they were second-class citizens. At least that's how I interpret what he's saying. Like, they're always seen as they need to be under surveillance because they're seen as like too impure, or they're too prone to causing some problem, I guess, in the mind of the people. So it's both, and there wasn't a vision of flourishing, but also they're seen as dangerous or impure or second-class citizens, or something thereof. So it's both angles are part. And I think the liberation that Sheila's approaching engages both of those.
Thank you for bringing that up and sharing that. That is so I think on point in terms of the line of thinking that I want to run with, and maybe perhaps even in this conversation. I mean, there's something to be said. We don't want to make this all about deconstruction and critique and all that, right? So definitely a constructive element later on. But in that second-class citizen thing, that's such a real dynamic. And I want to bring out two things here. So one of the texts that was really kind of a game changer for me was this book called The Romance of Innocent Sexuality by Jeffrey Rees. And so the author is a Yale-trained theologian or ethicist, and I think right now he's kind of moved into the art world. So kind of an interesting story with the author himself. But the premise of his book is basically like, even if you draw from the theologian St. Augustine, who has, in many instances, I personally am a fan of Augustine on a variety of his ways of thinking, and there are some things that I probably wouldn't be completely on board with, but in general, I think Augustine's really important to the conversation and not someone to kind of dismiss as being responsible for all the sexual rigidity and denigration or negative views or whatnot, right? That's very much, I think, too easy of a dismissal. I do appreciate him. And this Rees does a really interesting take on his doctrine of original sin, in which he basically, by the end of the book, kind of calls out the hypocrisy of, I think if we're looking at maybe mid 20th century America, this sanctification of heterosexual normative sex within the married matrix, that sexuality within the straight marriage confines somehow gives you a closer relationship with God, greater access, and subsequently creates this hierarchy of the false status of sexual innocence that straight people have who engage in their sexuality in the married confines, and everyone else is a sexual deviant. And basically, Rees calls that out and says, even if you go by Augustine, right? I mean, sexuality broadly, I mean, there's ways that there's pardons and forgiveness for, certain iterations of it tied to procreation. And he really was much of a moderate thinker in terms of, for his time in between Justinian and Jerome, that he was kind of a moderate thinker on sexuality and marriage. And so really interesting. Anyway, bringing back to this particular part of the conversation. So basically Rees is saying that you guys are hypocrites because basically you've kind of used sexuality as your alibi, like your innocent sexuality, and you've at the expense of everyone else, right? That everyone else is deviant, but somehow you're you're holier than thou. And he kind of has this Foucauldian inflection and basically says that the fiction of sex and thinking of sex as something worth dying for is this huge idolatry that straight Christian America has bought into. And there's so many problems with that, with its selfish privation of a good from everyone else. And ultimately, Rees, I think, makes an argument that is like, hey, we should go for pro-gay marriage because if it's under this rubric, then even the straight people or even straight people don't really deserve to have marriage or whatnot. Something broadly like that, like broadly arguing that Augustine is saying no to social sin, which straight America has essentially committed. So all that to say, you have queer people, women, people of color who have throughout Christian history been denigrated to perhaps a lower status just by virtue of who they are anyway, right? As women, going back to accounts of Genesis and the general vilification of women as, right, being temptresses or being those who are, right, like leading men to sin or something like that. And then people of color, you go back to colonial kind of discourses and, right, anything other than the European white male, there's some sort of problem just by virtue of who they are, right? And so that's the kind of thing. So, right, in these contemporary evangelical circles, there's maybe an unawareness that might be giving folks too much of a pass, but of how serious these hierarchies are at play actually, and that cause people such as maybe your friend to feel that they are treated as a second-class citizen. And I think, unfortunately, I mean, I feel like I resonate with that kind of experience in which, you know, just there's a higher suspicion of you, and there's completely this, people don't see the log in their own eye, right? And so to have kind of this theological rhetoric that Rees puts out, it kind of flips the script and basically is asking people to critically look at themselves. There's another writer, Daniel Patterson. I've really appreciated his work. It's called Reforming a Theology of Gender. It's constructive reflections on Judith Butler. And so Dan is a theologian, more in kind of the event conservative space, I would say. He's a self-proclaimed conservative thinker, and yet he did a dissertation for his PhD on Judith Butler, first thinking, he mentions this in his intro, and he says, well, to be quite honest, I was looking for a good topic to do a dissertation on, and then gender theory came up as a topic that conservatives haven't really engaged with. There's never been that stepping over. And he does that, I think, initially going in thinking, well, I'm going to take down Butler, and, you know, after I research her and her work, and then I'm just going to take down this thinker. Well, he came out of it actually with a really different result. I think he's not 100% convinced by Butler, but he also, I'm just going to give you this really quick quote, if that's okay. It's a couple sentences. Dan's writing basically calls out, what is it about, I think, maybe Christians' broad condemnation of people through this law that they have made up, this law of Adam and Eve, these false idolatrous images of Adam and Eve that they think people need to conform to as some sort of spiritual ideal, which is not the case, because at the end of the day, we're conforming into Christ, right? And so it's this false theology that somehow people have bought into, and they have all these socially constructed ideas about what it means to be male and female. And basically anyone who falls short of whatever their ideas, their imaginations of that are, they end up being condemned. And there's a lot of violence. And so I think he would even term it gender violence in that sense. So he says, without getting into the nitty-gritty of Butler's theories, he says, Butler's theory, when understood through a theological lens, provides us with an impetus to shift our gaze from the seductive bodies of Adam and Eve to the bloodied and scarred risen body of Jesus Christ. This makes Butler's voice strangely prophetic and redemptive. So just by examples, these two examples, I think so much of the work of the theologian looking for or trying to fight for queer liberation, really, no matter, I would argue, no matter your, I think to a degree, your certain theological convictions, even having a baseline that's established by these two accounts and the problems that they're calling out in the contemporary, I think, more conservative side of things is enough to sustain you as a launching pad to go into this, because I think we can all agree around that. And that's something that whether you're side A or side B, I think we can acknowledge this as a concrete lived experience, kind of an empirical, experiential kind of a fact that, okay, we do see this problem. We do have accounts of queer people who feel like second-class citizens. And now I'll give a caveat here. One of the problems is sometimes in certain circles, the experiences of queer people are not even believed. So there's the whole credibility issue. So that's not only with queer people, but that's been with women too, as we know, right? I think of the Me Too movement, or, you know, anytime that there's like a female account of some spiritual abuse or whatever, these things unfortunately are not always taken seriously. And that's a real issue. And I think that happens with queer voices as well. And the voices aren't even being listened to. They're disbelieved and they're discredited. By virtue, people already have their blinders on deliberately, because that's a queer person. They're kind of running with their queerness, and why should we listen to what they have to say, their sufferings or anything like that?
And yeah, I think that it would be easy for people to hear queer liberation, to hear the rejection of Adam and Eve as this like law of, you know, human value, or of what the kind of ideal is, and be like, wow, these people are just tearing apart the Bible. These people are, you know, like to do that othering, to do that, these people are the enemy. And for me, especially the side B perspective, is this weaving the thread of being able to see that the difference between holding Adam and Eve as the law for marriage, the standard for how we understand marriage to be between a man and a woman, versus this more sociological, just kind of moral lens for any human being that like, hey, you're incomplete until you get that spouse. If you aren't oriented towards pursuing marriage, then you're really not fitting the ideal of humanity. Being able to differentiate the biblical testimony of Adam and Eve from the way that we then use it as a proof text for our own cultural presuppositions and our internal biases. And it's just so easy to do that, where we're like, oh, I really believe what my gut says. I mean, this gets into the whole, you know, elephant in the rider with Jonathan Haidt. And so we then grasp for that kind of intellectual hook in which we can anchor our gut bias, and it'd be like, oh yeah, Adam and Eve, like that's why those people, you know, they make me uncomfortable. And in general, minority communities who are presenting something that you're different from will make people uncomfortable, and which then makes them like liable to be marginalized.
And the thing is, it's I think the problem is, so in the beginning of what you just said, right, it's this othering, that it's a refusal to even engage and to be dialogical, to consider the other perspective as perhaps being worth listening to, right? And so already, if it's already shut down. So recently there was something that came up, and this wasn't only pertaining to the queer issue, but there was some podcast clip that I saw of, I don't know if you guys know of the Beviers. They're like evangelical pastors, or they're writers. They're kind of these popular evangelical writers. And to be quite honest, I haven't really read much of their works, but the kind of rhetoric that they were propagating, that was kind of being circulated in some evangelical circles that I had previously kind of passed through, it was really troubling, because this little clip of their broader episode, it was just so antagonistic, in which, so they posed the question of, I think they think, and, you know, we would have to verify the stats and the numbers on this, but they think that there is a threat of a shrinking of the evangelical population, or kind of this conservative Christian population. And saying that there's a threat of Islam being the next thing that would come and, kind of sweep Christianity away. And they're saying that it's due to the fact that it's reproductive numbers. That, I mean, all of this is so problematic. Like I feel like even talking about it feels really uncomfortable. But then they say that there's a problem with men in Christianity becoming gay, in this whole thing, there's so many problems wrong with that, becoming effeminate. And so essentially reproductive numbers are lowering on the evangelical side. And that's this huge problem, that the white men of Christianity are the victims and everyone else is the problem. And so when you have, the reason I bring this up is this kind of rhetoric that's still circulating, no wonder there's so much hatred, and no wonder there's so much continued demonization, right? Because you are creating even greater polarization, and you are demonizing other faiths, and you're not looking at the log. You're not considering the log in your own eye, right? What have you considered? If there are waning numbers, that maybe it's because people are deconstructing because they're seeing the hypocrisies within your tradition's own confines. Yeah, and so I think, right, like with any camp that, someone proclaims himself to be in, I think even with my own context, wherever I end up or wherever I am in the given moment, I think it is kind of looking at a mirror, this self-examination dynamic. And so I think that's one of the things that's helpful with, I think, the Jesuit heritage that I'm kind of now immersed in, that, something like self-examination as a practice, as a spiritual practice, that's something that might be helpful as well.
I love those spiritual exercises. Could you, we have these kind of ways that some of our bad gut impulses can get mapped onto scripture inappropriately, but we want to, not throw out the scriptures. What are some places that you think with integrity you're hooking on these calls to inclusion, listening, love?
And I think the problem is, as it comes to Protestant hermeneutics and the way that you engage with the Bible, I do think that any claims of having a high view of the Bible and allowing that to be a weapon in order to kind of solidify or validate your views is kind of disingenuous. And I owe this to a scholarly friend of mine. He's been working on 20th century America, evangelicalism, and rhetoric surrounding queer people. And so, for instance, you look at the mainstream evangelical channels. So Christianity Today, for instance, I can't give you the exact issue, but I would say maybe mid-20th century, there were these conflations of even unisex clothing with, at the time, their problem with homosexuality as a sin. Just think about it, right? The way that the shifting definitions of sin using supposedly methods that value or have a high view of the Bible, right? So within evangelicalism, just to see how much that has shifted, and even kind of like the silliness of it, even if you look at it, of conflating those two things together, right? And, I'm not saying that, either of those things, I'm not talking about the validity of whether those things are sins or not, but I mean just the fact that those two things can be put into the same sentence and kind of given this attitude that they're of the same severity, right? And so all that to say, I think as it comes to, biblical hermeneutics and maybe the way that I use scripture these days, I think it's trying to bring a little more of a capacious approach to scripture. And so I've been, I think, trying to read more of Barth and thinking more largely of the 20th century theological giants and the way that they've engaged with scripture. So in a previous semester, in my first year of my PhD, I took a course on Eastern Orthodox theologian Bulgakov, and also of the Catholic side, Karl Rahner, and the way that they took scripture, but very philosophically, I think, inflected, and also trying to keep up with the various social science developments. I feel like those methods are attractive to me. And now that's not to say that I not to say that I've discarded with whatever a high view of scripture is, I think I still have a very reverential, or I reverence the Bible. In that sense, that's probably what I define would be a high view of the Bible. But I would say, yeah, I think I don't really love how proof texting has been weaponized. And so even as it comes to maybe like the liberation theology side of things, right, I would draw probably from an Exodus narrative, or kind of more broadly of, and there's contested definitions of what the imago Dei is, right? So what the image of God is, but really just that human intrinsic dignity. And also, I think what I'm really trying to wrestle with is, I think in a more progressive environment, I think the conversation around what holiness is something that I think needs more research and needs more dialoguing, right? So you would have this social justice, queer liberation element of human dignity and, you know, trying to dismantle or to call out all these various systemic oppressive elements that are hindering queer brothers and sisters. But I do think that there's not maybe enough research going into, okay, well, what about the conversation on holiness, right? To me, it feels like, to be a theological ethicist, that holiness would go hand in hand with justice. But it's not always the case, I think, in certain spaces that I've been in. And so I think I've realized that it'd be interesting to bring that piece back in, right? And of course, that'll kind of delve more into, oh, okay, well, ecclesiologically and also in a civil law kind of way, what kind of institutions are allowed. And, you know, that kind of moves us into the territory of, oh, okay, what about marriage as an institution, et cetera. I feel like that's one element. That's a sphere, but I don't think it's the end all be all, which I think is sometimes a problem. We're so focused on that I do think it's helpful to kind of engage or enter the conversation of sexual ethics and queer liberation from maybe a different entry point.
That's helpful. I'd love to hear more on this. I had a related question, maybe, going back to Adam and Eve. This is kind of my own wrestling. As I've been talking about, I mean, I focus a lot of my life and research energy on same-sex love and kinship. And also, as we've been engaging gender and gender minorities, transgender experiences, Adam and Eve come up in both cases. And I'm bringing them up because we just mentioned them. They are extremely prominent archetype for what an ideal relationship is, like man and woman. And that in these same-sex love, people are like, this is the ideal. Like, how can same-sex love be good if this is the ideal? And then for the trans conversations, just come up like, well, God made them male and female, so it's just this straight binary only. I'm trying to figure out in a theological method how to talk about, yes, Adam and Eve are somehow, their archetype is, there is one central archetype, but it's not the only archetype to use, or it's not like I don't know if I think this, I'm kind of wrestling with it. To what extent is it a determinative archetype? But I also generally hold what I associate with like an Orthodox position, where Adam and Eve were like, they were the young, they were like useful. They were not what God ultimately, God was intending a development over time for them. Like they were, something like that. And also we sometimes have this idea, at least in my circles, that the garden was the beginning, but the new hope is the city. Like the eschatological city is the development from the garden. Like there's some ship. I'm trying to think through these things. I don't know if you have any thoughts, Sheila. How do we relate to these archetypes? And so
I think if we like address the different elements in what you just mentioned, I think, okay, first starting point of, okay, admitting that there's, right, like how your definition of orthodoxy, once you throw in the considerations of power play and all these various elements, that I think you do come to admit a sort of hermeneutical indeterminacy, right? So basically that who gets to say what is the orthodox theology? And this is not me just trying to dismantle everything and queer everything, but right, like intellectually, right? Just kind of like whole. So I would say, okay, for instance, there's really brilliant work being done inside B, right? I respect someone like David Bennett a lot, and I really do love the work that he's doing with Eros and the way that he's engaging so Oliver O'Donovan's, evangelical ethics, considering the created order, etc. And for me, this is the thing, I think my broad stance is there needs to be space, even ecclesiologically, to have diverse opinions, because there is still so much theological mystery as it comes to, as a person who does value social scientific developments, right? And so I think in progressive spaces, the conversation has already moved to the point in which gender and sexuality is put into the category of issues that you should not be looking necessarily to the scriptures for scientific data. So this is not to say that archetypes become irrelevant, but it's given a different kind of a consideration, right? And so something like old earth versus young earth creationists, as someone who holds to exploring what evolutionary biology can tell us, that's something that you don't necessarily look to the literal words of the scripture to inform you about. And so when I think of trans brothers and sisters and all the things having to do kind of more of how our biological, our embodied selves, how they map or do not map onto some sort of archetype, which is indefinitive, right? We're not, just from the scripture, we're into kind of what I was, when I brought up Patterson's work, right? Whatever archetype we're holding on to or this ideal, we're not even sure if we can prove that's some sort of, how do you even define it? So some of the ways that I've been thinking about the points that you bring up is really considering evolutionary biology as it has to do with the complexity of our sexed bodies, right? And so I think at the moment I hold to something of a, gender, right? Kind of our mannerisms, etc. I mean, very much is the huge part of it is a socially constructed component. And as it comes to biological sex, even that, I mean, conversations today, right? Especially since Butler entered the scene, is something even that is contested. I mean, I would, probably not want to venture into that territory necessarily yet, but increasingly there's a scholar at Boston College. She did her dissertation on original sin and the evolution of sexual difference, and she's drawing from Anne Foster Sterling and Elizabeth Gross, and these interlocutors in her dissertation are basically making the case that there is a lot more of this interrelatedness and non-staticness to the ways that our bodies interact with our environment. So say something like our sexuality, that it probably has some hormonal genetic elements, but it also perhaps is influenced by the environment, right? So all that to say, if you're just looking scientifically and you're looking at statistically at any given moment, right? Okay, what is the percentage of people who don't fit into whatever these boxes are of the archetypes that we can't even define, right? To put in the first place. That really makes me question whether this is the thing. I mean, I have been in side B circles for a number of years, and I really just respect the posture of really wanting to seek radical inclusion for queer people and also radical holiness. And there are certain things that I'm also asking questions about. And this aspect, I think some of the issues we're talking about and some of the things that you said, TJ, are the questions that I have, right? How can it be that every single person who perhaps is same-sex oriented, that they are automatically called into celibacy, even though Paul says celibacy is a gift, though, and that straight people have marriage as kind of a means of, containing their passion, for example, as kind of to deal with it, and which I don't think is the healthiest theology to begin with, but also that, right, like, is it better to have that as an option as opposed to all queer people somehow miraculously being expected to just be committed to a life completely without sex, even though they're sexed beings? And so that's the thing. It's a hard thing to balance, because I also think that in our hyper-sexualized culture, sex, sexuality, and marriage have been made to be idols themselves, right? That's part of the tension. And I don't want to give into that either. But also there is like this realism, like a realistic element where straight people, right, we don't give them enough scrutiny for how proper, right, if there is a propriety to their sexuality within their marital confines, right? I mean, there's no one going around, policing that. Why is it that queer people then are policed and regulated? Like, there's something to be said about that. And so one of the things of engaged ethics is, one of my professors was really helpful in kind of opening my eyes to even considering like a meta approach to that, where we're not just doing sexual ethics, but we're doing the ethics of sexual ethics. So you're looking at, right, like how are we, what are the different factors? And so trying to apply biblical ethics to our modern day context is really, you really have to unpack all the elements that have created the trends that have come down through time, and considering like what were all the things that built those ethics. And then you have to admit of the gap and how hard it is to then translate that into our modern context, right? So for instance, romantic love was kind of this sentimental marriage or companionate marriage wasn't even a thing until like the 18th or 19th centuries, right? And so right, like, so romantic, right? Or like the what is it, like aesthetics, the romance era, right? Like it all kind of was very much a situated, located kind of a thing. And so we're talking about really specific concepts that we're arguing about, I think, in our contemporary conversations on things like sexuality and marriage. And so if you also look at sexuality as given by the church through much of the time, right? It is male-centered. It's male-centered. It's procreative-centered. And right, very specific. And so once you're kind of considering these elements, or even like this hypothesis or this theory that really the human person, considering there's something called like the one sex model, right? That essentially the human was defined by the male. And it really wasn't until kind of maybe, I think, post-Enlightenment that where feminists, kind of thought came in. You have the French Revolution, and so many different social currents and historical events have really brought us to a current moment in which things that we take for granted, like women's rights, etc., really they weren't a thing until relatively recently. And so I think folks fail to consider what has been the case, that they think there's this transhistoric monolithic sexual ethic that I think sometimes the church or the evangelical church wants us to think, but it's just not the case.
It's complex. The historical and social currents are quite complex.
Yeah, and I would check out Nisa, TJ, Gregory of Nyssa, in terms of maybe looking at some varying theologies of the archetypes of Adam and Eve. Yeah, just to expand the variety.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
And as people are thinking about archetypes, I don't think we have time to go into it, but just want to highlight the archetype of the eunuch as this unique, I think generally understood as this post-fall, but yet blessed archetype that we find within scriptures. And I think that's part of the moving from the garden to the city, is that we're actually moving. It's not just a straight line of development. There's actually this redemptive aspect where we're taking things that were thought to be broken and then, have unique blessing. And the other thing, just in thinking about, TJ mentioned Orthodox perspective that emphasizes the naivety and youth of Adam and Eve. I think about how when I be like, oh, was your father, your grandfather always so like gentle and kind? Like, oh no, not till they got old. Like people like it's not often. A lot of men, they soften up, they become more tender and affectionate as they become grandpas. Not all, but in terms of what we think is the ideal male, are we picturing the 22-year-old or are we picturing the 88-year-old?
Right.
And that is just interesting for me to think about where we try to anchor our ideal archetypes around.
Right. That's actually really interesting that you brought that up, because also, right, our sexuality in each stage of our lives, right, it's for different things, or it manifests in different ways. And I think talking about sexuality in a way in which it's just static, that it's always for maybe this one thing, is maybe, right, maybe not complex, or maybe not nuanced enough.
I mean, one of the key, as a social scientist, one of the key things that I think about is kind of we are alluding to already. Much of human life, much of the natural world, you might say, is in flux. It's moving, it's changing. It might be some commonality, but over time, but there's still evolutions, there's development, and that has to be part of that should be part of our theological process as well. But I say that at the same time, as a person who, by sensibility, I also like authority and I like continuity. You know, it's like both hand. So it's a lot of my life as a thinker has been trying to integrate this desire for authority, continuity, stability, but also this recognition that a lot of life is changing, shifting, moving, developing. So this will probably be a whole life endeavor, or maybe many lifetimes. But how do we relate continuity and discontinuity, changing and development, with order and continuity? And those are just simple binaries. There's more complex interplay between systems of change and continuity and order and stuff. But yeah, and that this plays in our theological endeavor too, as we talk about sexual ethics or other things. So
that makes me think of Leah Labresco. Sheila, have you interacted at all with Leah Labresco Sargent's work?
Let me write that down.
Okay. We just had her on recently, and her new book, just by the time this is released, would have come out October 1st, The Dignity of Dependence, a Feminist Manifesto. And she just hits into some of the biological fluctuations in a pretty, she's coming from a Catholic perspective, but also just a very like on the ground perspective that I really appreciate.
Okay, fascinating. Yeah, I'll definitely check it out. I feel like this year I'm really trying to dive into both the more evolutionary components and also the psychological. And that's actually one of the moves I'm trying to make also is, so arguing from a concrete reality in which, right, like thinking of attachment theory in psychology, and then bringing that together with a realistic look at human biology, human evolutionary biology, and also the problem of collective trauma that has inflicted queer people, right? Whether it's spiritual trauma or maybe like as subcategories, emotional abuse or psychological abuse. If you are looking at the human person and just trying to construct a rough rubric for what I think flourishing looks like, I think there's a way to do that and be able to argue that that's something that's kind of a rock to kind of base your research from, and saying that whatever is not allowing maybe these social, scientifically measured indicators, if they're not hitting some sort of like buoyant kind of standard, that we might have an issue. And this is someone, right? I do think I revere this scripture, and yet if there's some fundamental disconnect that is causing people, right? Bad theology kills. If it's causing people to have suicidal ideation or some very just concrete issues, then I think that's worth considering as something to kind of run with, if that makes sense, right? And so, which is another, just throwing in why I think like the social scientific elements are really important in this conversation.
I'm currently going through kind of licensure and studying within the same denomination as Tim Keller.
Okay.
May he rest in peace. And one of the kind of pieces in there is this test of truth, which is basically when Jesus says, look at that tree, it's not bearing fruit. So exactly what you're saying, that like good theology produces good fruit. And so if bad theology is producing both like if it's not producing holiness, if it's producing death, then it is bad theology. And I think the there's a lot of pastoral components in that as well, as to how the right truth in the right moment is a much more of a gardener tending to a garden with the truth of God than merely trying to like force in a quick way certain archetypes on people, not being sensitive to.
I love that. Yeah, totally. Yeah. I really appreciate that. And I think, as I'm also looking at our clock, so it's like the kind of, I think, research or that the kinds of projects that I'm interested in hoping more people kind of jump into as well is that, I don't feel like I'm trying to prescribe either okay, well, here's a, side whatever letter ethic, but rather I think I want to create spaces in which we kind of honestly admit what elements are still mysterious given, right, certain developments in both the theological side as well as the social scientific side, right, or the various subsides of that. And to kind of then disentangle our authentic pursuit of truth, if that's ever possible, with all of the, I think, the noise and all of the voices that aren't authentically, right, really trying to engage in the same way. And I think we're living in a time in which there's so much weaponized rhetoric, and I think issues around gender and sexuality are used as kind of these pieces in this, right? Like they're like pawns. And I think people are being thrown under the bus as rage bait. And I think it becomes really difficult to discern or to engage in honest dialogue when you don't really know if people are coming from a true pursuit of what is in your best interest, right? So what's in the best interest of queer people. And I think thinking back to TJ and in his valuing of tradition and I think stability, I think that's really important too, right? I think retrieving theology, going back to someone like Augustine, and I think maybe it's the case in which as humanity continues to move through time and linear history that, right, like every once in a while there's kind of this, okay, like how do we adjust to our situation and how do we reform, right? Like reform as a word. And that has happened so many different times. And I mean, our history, our Christian heritage and in the different traditions is such a diverse and interesting thing to study. And so I think just having an appreciation for how many different perspectives at a given moment, right? Time and space for the plethora of issues that the church has ever dealt with, how diverse those conversations have been. Even holding on to that simple piece or that fact, I think can really help us to have a healthier posture towards talking about something like sexuality and gender in a way that we don't immediately kind of shut down the conversation in fear or anxiety of that we're going off the rails or something. I have to say that having been in different spheres of theological thought, I think we miss each other. I think conservatives miss people who are more progressive thinking, and I think more progressive thinkers maybe think of one thing, of who belongs in the conservative category or something like that. So I think it'd just be helpful to be more dialogical and to have more conversations as you guys are facilitating, which I'm really grateful that you guys are doing.
Thank you so much for helping contribute to it. I totally, we just are all too easily on a church level, on a denominational level, pointing out the speck in others' eyes and ignoring the log in our own. And it requires actually dialoguing with sometimes people who feel like our fierce opponents. But
sure. Before we close, Sheila, is there any way people could follow you or connect with you if they're
Right. So I think I'm mainly active on Instagram. Folks can follow me. My handle is She Chan with like 5 N's. So SHECHA and then like 5 N's. So yeah, and I also write on Substack, but I haven't been doing it that much. But if you visit my Instagram, then you'll find pathways to that if you're ever interested.
I mean, before we close, I just want to say I'm really thankful, Sheila, that you're coaching some of these topics. And I'm really thankful that I know you have this desire for integrating both radical holiness and radical inclusion. And it's complicated, you know.
It's
like,
complicated.
It's not always easy. It's not always easy to know. We're not quite sure what that looks like in full as of yet.
Yeah.
But I'm really happy that you're pursuing that project because it's so needed. And I hope your work bears a lot of fruits. And I hope in the next chapter, you and I will keep talking, and because I think we're interested in a similar project. So, yeah.
Amazing. Yeah. Thank you guys both. Yeah. Thank you so much. This has been very lovely.
Yeah. Thank you.
If you want to support our work, tell a friend about an episode that you enjoyed. People who value this podcast usually find it through someone else. If you'd like to help us cover costs, you can become a supporter on Substack. While all episodes are available to current and future listeners, paid subscribers get extra sign-up perks.